Good morning, everybody. My name is Isbedi Torres, and today I will be talking about the Dickey Amendment and its effects on school shootings. So as many of you may know, on May 24th, 2022, 19 students and 2 teachers lost their lives at the Robb Elementary School shooting in Uvalde, Texas. This came almost 10 years after a strikingly similar tragedy at Sandy Hook Elementary. A lack of police presence and incompetent leadership on behalf of Chief Arredondo caused an uproar amongst the Uvalde community, with many calling for action to be taken against the officers, claiming that had they responded a lot quicker, some of these victims would have survived. This really draws our attention to the importance of determining whether law enforcement has the resources, if they're properly equipped, to respond to mass shootings and specifically school shootings. However, school shootings are extremely rare. They happen, the likelihood that a school will face one is once in every 10,000 years. However, the 1999 Columbine shooting, which is considered to be the first modern school shooting in the United States, created what is known as a moral panic, which is when there's a circumstance that arises and makes people feel like it is a danger to societal order. And this is really what motivated my research question. Because ultimately, we hear a lot about what people say about the Dickey Amendment and how it limits how much we know about school shootings, but nobody talks about the role of law enforcement within the gun research discussion. And my question being, to what extent does the 1996 Dickey Amendment affect law enforcement's ability to predict and prevent school shootings in the United States? I went about answering this question by looking into the works of several scholars and what is said about publications in the post-Dickey era, the school shooter profile and the dangers that it poses in the hands of law enforcement, as well as the arguments behind having guns in schools, namely the arming of teachers and campus carry policies. But what exactly is the Dickey Amendment, and how did it come to be? Well, in 1993, the New England Journal of Medicine published a highly controversial article, which claimed that the presence of a firearm in a home increased the risk of homicide. Now, the National Rifle Association, or simply the NRA, disagreed with this publication, and it called for the defunding of its sponsoring organization, namely the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC. So the NRA joined forces with a congressman, J. Dickey, from Arkansas, to create a new provision for the 1997 Appropriations Bill. And essentially what the Dickey Amendment did was that none of the funding which was provided to the CDC could be used to promote or advocate for gun control. Now, even though this amendment did not mean that the CDC had to stop researching guns altogether, that's essentially what they did. They curtailed funding for all of these programs, and anything that had to do with firearm violence, we saw a drastic decrease in how much was being published. However, even though this was only supposed to affect the CDC, we also see a decline in how many publications are being made in academic institutions, both public and private. That's going to show the extent to which the Dickey Amendment influenced the United States. And some scholars have really tried to understand the extent of this. And one of these studies looked into publications in the social behavioral sciences, life sciences, as well as clinical, between 1981 and 2018 to determine how the Dickey Amendment had affected how much we have access to this research. And what they saw was that between around 2002 and 2011, we see a considerable decrease in the publications in all 3 of these fields. And they argue that this is consistent with the Dickey Amendment because even though it was passed in 1996, there's a gap between when this funding is actually awarded to institutions and when the publications actually go into print. And we do see an increase in this in 2012. However, a lot of the publications that came out after this time were influenced by NRA lobbying, as now scholars had to focus specifically on individual risk factors rather than firearm violence as a problem as a whole. This really goes to show how the Dickey Amendment went as far as to restrict public health research and what we know about that. But going into the role of law enforcement, police officers are supposed to make students feel safe, promote safety in schools. However, there are a lot of concerns about having them in these academic institutions for fear that they may criminalize behavior that would otherwise be simply dealt with through disciplinary action. And the dangers behind the school shooter profile is that typically what people think of is that this is a white male who is very quiet, spends a lot of time alone, which unfortunately, one, describes a large portion of the population at any school, and two, is completely skewed and fails to account for the fact that these are also characteristics of maybe troubled youth, but not necessarily harmful. And this led to Peter Langman to argue that there are actually 3 different types of school shooter typologies, namely psychopathic, traumatized, and psychotic, with each of these accounting for differences in personality types, various personality disorders, as well as different proficiencies when it comes to social functioning. And all of this really goes to show the fact that we don't know as much about this, because even though Langman went very, very much into depth about all of this, he's one of the few scholars that have really pushed the boundaries of what we know about school shooters themselves. And his work isn't necessarily through funding received from the government. But getting into the school, within the schools themselves, the average school shooting or active shooting lasts only about 300 seconds. Yet it takes upwards of 10 to 30 minutes for law enforcement to arrive at a scene. And because of this, people have argued that if we arm our teachers, they will be able to provide a more speedy response and also provide additional assistance to school resource officers, or SROs. However, there are concerns about this, with critics arguing that it would increase the risk of accidental injury or potential death from having these additional firearms in a campus. It would also lead to fear among students and also cause confusion for SROs. Because when school shootings take place and law enforcement arrives at the scene, they have very, very little time to determine whether that person who has a gun is an ally or if they're a foe. And because of this, the teacher who is holding this weapon has the risk of becoming an accidental victim while trying to respond to this scene. And there's also other critics that argue that teachers don't have the same type of training as law enforcement, and there are doubts as to whether they would be able to properly respond to these school shootings in the first place. And then the school shooting we saw at Virginia Tech University led to other questions regarding campus carry policy specifically. Now, we've had several studies that have looked into how students, how staff, faculty react to the ideas of campus carry, but very few have attempted to understand how law enforcement feels about these policies. And one of the studies that I did find, even though there were very few, took place here in the state of Texas. They interviewed some of the top universities of the state, as well as their law enforcement agencies, to determine how they felt about this. And the consensus was that 91.5% opposed open carry on a college campus, namely because having an exposed weapon would increase the fear of crime and victimization within a university population. At a national scale, a different study conducted in the same year, 2015, also went around asking law enforcement how they felt about this, and about 96% of them argued that they felt like law enforcement needed to be included in these discussions with administration when determining whether they were going to implement or ban campus carry. However, the limitation behind these is that they both came from polls. They came from surveys. This goes to show just another way in which how the Dickey Amendment has affected empirical research, because we don't have much as to campus carry when it comes to concealed permits and how they would respond to that. And we don't have as much when it comes into the perpetrators of violent crime. And overall, what this means is that just like how the Columbine shooting redefined the American education system, the Dickey Amendment revolutionized how we deal with this gun research argument. Because ultimately, the Dickey Amendment is not about gun rights, but rather how we fund essential research. But we've become so polarized in recent years with people arguing on either side of the political spectrum, whether they're pro-guns, whether they're pro-gun control. And this has limited how many civil discussions we can have about school shootings. And whenever we have one of these, people are always talking about guns, how are we going to deal with them? But nobody really brings in to the spotlight the need for research to really make these policies. So ultimately, what the Dickey Amendment would do is that it affects how we propose our legislation. It also affects how much we know about these potential threats and what we can do to keep our schools safe. Because even though there are disagreements as to how everyone responds to guns, we can all agree about the need to reduce how much violent crime occurs and how we can keep our schools safe. So hopefully one day we can see a world where our policies are driven by facts rather than feelings in the United States. Here are my references, and thank you.